Well, if you have an interest in mediocre philosophy that is only a modicum more sophisticated than a Joe Bart video, you have come to the right place. You may notice that I did not make any mention as to whether or not everyday consciousness is discrete or continuous. That is because I figure it as a sort of basic introduction to the sort of concept. Sleep is a sort of better segue, but I am rolling that idea into my probability sort of assessment, so do what you will with that choice to exclude that. It is, of course, very interesting, and I could say a lot about it. I could say more about what I've said in this video, but I figured this was a good place to leave it, so hope you enjoy. It is important to be upfront. I believe this. So I will cut right to the chase upfront and say that it is not overwhelmingly clear that you die in your sleep. The point, however, is that it is not very clear as to whether you do or do not. And this is pretty crucial because it is a defining point of our existence and what we believe to be true. To really bolster this point, I am now going to cite a couple of somewhat controversial positions that I think actually have more evidence behind a particular conclusion than the idea that we make it through the night. Some of these positions would include the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald assassinating JJK, I said JJK, I'm keeping that in, that he assassinated JFK was actually independently carried out and not a part of a grand conspiracy. The fact that rent control or rent freeze is unequivocally as a standalone bad economic policy. The fact that Momoko from Rampart Device is not actually that bad of a person or character. And finally, that evolution/vaccines are overwhelmingly proven and successful. Let me assure you, I am not trying to rage bait anyone by throwing out these particular conclusions that are relatively controversial in online internet spaces. I'm attempting to point out and give perspective to the fact that a question that is much more crucial to our own existence is actually perhaps less evidence-backed than these other more mundane, everyday topics that really a lot of people would still consider to be fairly unclear. Without further ado, let's get into the actual problem of why this is a problem. When do you die? This is a particularly interesting question. If you asked a wide range of people, you would get a wide range of answers. Some of these might include brain death, when your heart stops, when you stop breathing. A potentially very intellectually snobby person might say something more metaphorical along the lines of when your legacy is forgotten, or something like this. Which of these, if any, is correct? Well, implicitly, I think brain death is the closest, because it gestures at what we care about. What is brain death? Brain death is merely a biological threshold at which we believe the brain's main functions have stopped functioning. And this corresponds to the important thing, which is the person themselves, their conscious experience ending to never return. Of course, in order to answer the question of when something disappears, you first have to define what it is. So this begs the question, what are you? And why is a conscious experience the important defining marker? At a cursory glance, and a lot of the time in our everyday conversation, it makes sense to say that there are multiple properties or features of a person that are inseparable from their character and their existence. Some of these may include their body, their personality, their memories, and so on. But if you truly examine these a bit deeper, it becomes apparent that you can at least alter them to some degree, without it making sense to say that that person has disappeared along with their alterations. This seems to indicate that perhaps you are more so the canvas, and then these external features that are really not, and they're more in the periphery, are more akin to the paint that is being put on the canvas to have a completed painting. Why is an enduring conscious perspective attached to an individual the grounds for personal identity, and in this analogy, our canvas? Well, to put it simply, it is the distinction between inanimate and animate. It is what separates a rock from a person. It is only a matter of degree once they cross the threshold of there being a conscious perspective. A conscious perspective is from where every single qualia one ever experiences, or anything they will ever know, occurs from within. It is where the feeling of pain comes from, the experience of seeing green, fuzziness, when you understand a math problem, your memories. All of these things can only ever operate within consciousness because anything you ever will know will be from within that perspective, since if it were outside, you wouldn't know it. Most of us have actually probably already surreptitiously engaged with this problem in the form of the content that we consume. We've all probably seen a movie where there's a plot line of a time loop where a character sees, you know, younger versions of their friends, family, and even themselves. There are also scenarios where we see duplicates or really all of these sorts of problems present themselves, and yet we all intuitively understand up front that that's not the same person because they're looking at you and you're looking at them from your own individual perspectives without access to the other one. Let's say that we take all of this to be true. Thank you, I think that it is. Where does this leave us? Well, we seem to have answered the question. When do you die? Well, if what you are is an enduring conscious perspective, then the point at which you die is when that ceases to endure. Now the question only becomes a fact of the matter claim of when that occurs. So what are the sort of everyday scenarios that we encounter that really test these boundaries? Do we have examples where potentially someone is a duplicate of themselves? I suspect that even had you not seen the title of the video, you've probably figured out the big one. Sleep. This may be a state where there are periods where genuine cessation of consciousness occurs, and we all go through it. There are clearly periods during sleep where someone is dreaming and they themselves can be as certain of their continued existence during that time as they are during any wakened moment. But the problem is that it's not entirely self-evident that every stage of sleep is a dream, and that there is conscious activity at all points. Typically, there is a separation made between REM and NREM sleep, or deep sleep, wherein brain activity is substantially lowered, and it is not entirely clear whether or not that level of brain activity corresponds to a person literally to any degree. There are two general camps that I would deem as fairly plausible in explaining what is going on during deep sleep to consciousness. The first of which is the rather bleak picture that I am hinting at, where there is a full-blown eradication of consciousness and then reproduction based on similar content at a later stage, which would be akin to dying repeatedly, and therefore really your lifespan would not be more than a day. The second camp, and this is slightly more well supported, I would argue, is a continuous perspective wherein during sleep there is diminished content and problems with memory function so that you fail to remember periods where there is some sensation going on, and there was never truly that same full-blown eradication. Why is this second view more plausible? Well, to start with, we already know that during sleep, consciousness is undergoing transformations. It is occurring in what could be considered diminished content in many respects, and we also just observe that the parts of the brain that correspond to memory are naturally not activated in a way that you would expect there to be self-reporting at certain stages. This essentially perfectly fits with the data we observe. The only difference is there is a more parsimonious solution, which is transformations, which are in line with the diminished activity that we see, but not an absence of activity in the brain, and therefore this seems to fit better than a very radical sort of eradication, replacement, eradication, replacement over and over again when we can't really find that exact dividing line, and we already kind of expect to see what we see given this more reasonable model. In case you have considered it, this is essentially the same line of argumentation that applies to other states of diminished consciousness that potentially could show absence, such as amnesia, seizures, and so on. Comas, these sorts of things where it's not exactly clear. But we just run into the same sort of idea. We have a recreation model and we have a continuation model. We do not have the ability to detect where a clear dividing line should be, and we already know that transformed states of the same conscious mind exist because we see them all over the place. You have dreams, you have trips, you have hallucinations, all these different modifications, and it's just not entirely clear where that complete absence may lie, short of a very extreme state such as brain death. You may, however, recognize that this is by far from a certainty. I mean, a lot of this argument lies in the fact that we just don't have the ability and understanding of the mechanisms and structures that correspond to a clear, divided conscious experience to the extent that we can confidently assert these things. What is the difference between amnesia and deep sleep? Well, there's more activity in deep sleep, but we don't know at what level of activity or where the activity occurs that corresponds to the conscious experience we care about. It's just not something that is in principle easy to verify because we are arriving at the point of conscious experiences where self-reporting is not an option. And on top of that, experimentally pinpointing these things is just exceedingly difficult. I really don't have any desire to give people an existential crisis. Fortunately, due to my lack of outreach and people's general lack of interest in this prospect of a question, I doubt that will be of any concern. But at the very least, I hope you found it somewhat interesting, and I appreciate you watching, and look forward to seeing you next time.